This is the second part of the discussion of Daisy Miller. Currently on the screen you'll see a part that we looked at last time a little bit, but I want to go back over a couple of lines here. This is when they visit the castle. When you look at it, of course, it looks like the castle at Chillon, or Chillon. It's actually pronounced Chillon, but of course, as you look at it, the word chill comes through, coinciding with the idea that I mentioned last time in regard to Winterborn, the idea of the old tradition and stuck in place, frozen in place, if you will, attitude that Daisy Miller is the force against. Again, Daisy, the fresh attitude and innocence and the American spirit, if you will, that she represents, contrasted with the chill, the staid attitude of the old world, and so you have that conflict going on. And so Chillon or Chillon helps to emphasize that point for us. This is when they go to that castle, and while they're there and she insists that they take the steamer over, and they could have taken a carriage, but instead they go with the steamer because she wants to, and she's open and talking with people, and Winterborn, of course, regards that as flirting. As it says here, she was not fluttered. She blushed neither when she looked at him or when she saw people were looking at her. Says that Winterborn looks at this and he takes satisfaction, and here's the part right here, in his pretty companion's distinguished air, that she comes across looking very attractive. Other people are noticing her, and again there's that word pretty that I mentioned in the previous video that Winterborn constantly is using to label Daisy as being. So as he listens and watches her, this is the part they said he regarded as the most charming garrulity he had ever heard, as she keeps talking, as it says here about a number of original reflections. Her conversation was chiefly of what metaphysicians term the objective cast, that just overly disgusting points and just making general observations. And this is what he decides, that she was common. But he starts questioning, but was she so, or was he simply getting used to her commonness? Remember, that's the distinction that his aunt had, that the Millers are common people. And again, a very big distinction. Remember that Randolph has told Winterborn that their father is rich, that he is wealthy, that he has made his fortune. But Winterborn's aunt, Mrs. Costello, has inherited wealth. And so you have the distinction, even between these two Americans, that there's inherited wealth and then there's new wealth. This attitude of the Americans that James is looking at, this view about how the old world, the old traditions, are now being abruptly butted up against by a new spirit, a new attitude. And this is what we see here in this particular one. So they go to Chillon, and they look and see it, and they're going to meet later. And this was a big aspect, as it says here, that he promised to come down to Rome in the winter, because that's where they're going. Remember, they're going to Italy. And Winterborn says, my aunt is taking an apartment for the winter, and she's already asked me to come and see her. And then this is what Daisy says at the end of part 2. I don't want you to come for your aunt. I want you to come for me. And we start seeing that Daisy is asking something of Winterborn. Winterborn is supposed to be coming through Europe studying, and he never does that. He's 27. How far into college is he, or studying is he supposed to be? He should have already been through. This whole attitude is that he's not doing anything. He is just existing. Daisy wants him to commit. She wants him to come to Rome for her. And you see this demand. Remember, she's a flirt, as he calls her. But none of that is taken seriously. Says she is teasing. And so the result is that you have this conflict happening. Winterbourne tells his aunt they've gone to the castle with Daisy, and the Trigger's staying at home. She went with you all alone, Mrs. Costello asked. All alone. And that is the young person you wanted me to know. And so you have that very strict attitude. What is proper? What is not? Mrs. Costello saying this is how one is supposed to behave. That one is supposed to be very circumspect. Follow tradition. And Daisy doesn't. She is alone with a man. But of course, Winterbourne doesn't get blamed. Notice that Mrs. Costello doesn't blame him for it, taking advantage of an innocent young girl. No, it's the young woman. There's the distinction that we start seeing that James is looking at. It's that very sharp idea. Now, when you go into the next part of the novel, it picks up several weeks, months later, when he does go to Rome. It says his aunt had already gone there several weeks before. He doesn't go immediately. He had promised Daisy he would be there. She, of course, wanting him to come for her, and he doesn't. Rather, what we wind up seeing is that when he gets to Rome, he doesn't look for the Millers immediately. Says as here, in the natural course of events, he would have found their address and gone to pay his compliments to Miss Daisy. Notice it's Miss Daisy. This idea of using that attitude, a respectful attitude, but for the most part, he doesn't do that. In fact, what he, looks at and goes into, this is Mrs. Costello, who obviously has kept up with the gossip about the Millers, says the girl goes about alone with her foreigners. She has picked up half a dozen of the regular Roman fortune hunters. When she comes to party, she brings with her a gentleman with a good deal of manner and a wonderful mustache. And where's the mother, he wants to know, and the response is, they are very dreadful people. Again, Mrs. Costello, because these people do not conform to her standards of behavior, it makes them dreadful. Winterbourne excuses it as if they just are not aware. They're very ignorant, very innocent, that they are not bad. But what we wind up seeing is a great deal of distinction between what is appropriate, good behavior, and what is deemed as inappropriate. Daisy is seen as inappropriate. She goes about in public. She is spirited. She enjoys herself. She's on vacation. And keep that in mind. That's what she is. They're on vacation. This is not some grand tour that was very popular in the early part of the 19th century, in the late 18th century, where young men especially would go and learn. It would be a furthering of their education. Daisy's not going through Europe for education. She's going there to see things, to enjoy herself. Winterbourne seemingly is supposed to be in Europe to be learning and studying. That's what is stated early. Isn't doing any of that. Again, Mrs. Costello's view is that the Millers are vulgar people, that they are common, and again, as it says here, they are bad enough to dislike. That is quite enough. And that's how she views it. These are the kind of people you are not supposed to, one, associate yourself with. Two, these are the kind of people you dislike because of who they are, their background, how they behave, not meeting the expectations and standards that Mrs. Costello holds. But remember, Mrs. Costello is also not necessarily shunned, but she is also not really considered to be very important in Europe, that she keeps to herself. Remember, the servants have the comments about her that, of course, Daisy finds out because she talks with the maids. And we know that Mrs. Costello is also viewed by the European society as less than acceptable. And the result is what we wind up with is this layering where you have one group looking down on someone else who promptly looks down on someone else. Mrs. Costello, as I said earlier, inherited wealth. She has that East Coast upbringing. The Millers lack that. They are from upstate New York, Schenectady, which at that time would be considered not, the sophisticated part of New York. It would be sort of the cultureless or the common area or almost country-ish. And their money is made money. But keep that in mind that this is how James is looking at this changing nature of society. That America represents the emerging culture. The European, which Miss Costello is establishing herself in or trying to, is the culture that has been. That is supposed to be the one that gives the standards for everyone else to try to match. Well, the American view, as James is looking at it, are not concerned with what used to be. It's what they're going to make. The eyes are toward the future. And everything about Europe was about the past. Now again, I made this point in the first video. James himself winds up not coming back to America. He goes over and travels a few places, establishes himself in England, and becomes a British citizen eventually. What you wind up seeing is that as he shows us America via Daisy, we're starting to see something different and unique that is American. That's the part that is being offered. That this is a different world, that the world is changing. And Daisy represents that. But it's also an image of something that, what happens when the new and the fresh is opposed by the old. Not necessarily what we would like to see. Again, in this part, we have Winterbourne focusing strictly on behavior, the idea about outward signs, and his focus on Daisy and her physical. Again, the image of a very pretty girl. That's what comes to his mind. The image that had come to him. He's seeing a very pretty girl, and he wants the image, much as if you are looking at a painting. Because that's what the old world is. You want to see things static. The idea of seeing this pretty girl, and she needs to meet the standards of what a pretty girl is supposed to be, how she's supposed to behave, meet the standards. And when she doesn't, Winterbourne allows himself to go with the entrenched views and values. He's an American. He should be embracing the new, but he doesn't. He refuses to. So as you go through this one, they eventually see each other. He goes to visit Mrs. Walker, and they encounter the Millers there. And so you have this view here. I'm going to go down here. This is a little comment about Daisy says, I've been telling Mrs. Walker how mean you were. And again, this is a view about how he was supposed to have come seen him. And again, this is the part about Mrs. Miller telling Winterbourne, society's splendid. She goes around everywhere. She knows a great many gentlemen. She thinks there's nothing like Rome. And again, this is part of what we're looking at. She knows a great many gentlemen. That would be unacceptable. Young women are supposed to associate with young women and only be seen in the company of men when they are being chaperoned properly. Parents there, other adults, older. And Daisy goes around with gentlemen she has met. But remember, she's already told Winterbourne that. that when she's back home, that's what she sees. She sees gentlemen all the time. She has a number of admirers come to see her, and that's the company she keeps at home. She's not drawing any distinction in her behavior. What she did at home, she's doing in Europe. There is no difference. But Europe, the old world, is expecting her to meet its standards. And so we have this distinction, and Winterbourne allows himself to fall back into that one. Again, another little comment down here. Winterbourne, he knew, about Daisy says Giovanelli is an Italian, a great friend of mine, handsomest man in the world, except Mr. Winterbourne. That's what Daisy. He knows plenty of Italians, but he wants to know some Americans. He thinks ever so much of Americans. And this is a telling remark. Giovanelli thinks ever so much of Americans. Mrs. Costello, Mrs. Walker, and also, of course, Winterbourne then do not think so much of Americans. Their views are that there are some Americans who are acceptable, but many who are not. Hence, how they regard the Millers. I'm going down here a little bit, where Daisy then talks to Winterbourne and wants to know, why haven't you been to see me? Says, I have had the honor of telling you I have only just stepped out of the train. You must have stayed in the train a good deal after it stopped. This idea about this view, that aspect. And again, down here, where Mrs. Walker and the discussion there, and they talk, and Daisy makes this comment about Rome. We're going to stay all winter, even if there's a fever, what's called Roman fever, which is basically malaria. And then she makes a comment, we're going to stay all summer if we don't die of the fever, and I guess we'll stay then. Which, that's a little foreshadowing here. It says down here, it says, we only been here, I know ever so many people, and they are also charming. The society's extremely select. There are all kinds, English and Germans and Italians. I think I like the English best. I like their style of conversation. But there are some lovely Americans. I never saw anything so hospitable. There's something or other every day. There's not much dancing. I was always fond of conversation. So she's talking about the society extremely select. And Daisy's being accepted briefly, but not always. And so you have, the details here where she's going to go talk to the young man. Do you mean to speak to that man, Winterbourne? Do I mean to speak to him? Why, you don't suppose I mean to communicate by signs? I mean, it's like, what do you mean not go talk to the guy? And Winterbourne is insisting that he accompany her. And this is what she tells him. I don't like the way you say that. It's too imperious. I've never allowed a gentleman to dictate to me or to interfere with anything I do. And this becomes a really telling remark of the independence, the spirit that Daisy has about her and that she represents. This attitude and view that no one will dictate to her. It becomes a telling remark because the next comment from Winterbourne shows his view about listening to people. I think you have made a mistake. You should sometimes listen to a gentleman, the right one. There's the line being drawn that Winterbourne sees between proper behavior and improper behavior. What he expects and wants as opposed to how he regards Daisy as behaving. That her behavior needs to conform. She talks about Mr. Giovanelli, and his comment, of course, is that's not the right man. Well, Daisy introduces them. They, are there, and they're walking together. Winterbourne accompany both her and Giovanelli. Mrs. Walker comes by in a carriage. And her comment is, it is really too dreadful. That girl must not do this sort of thing. She must not walk here with you two men. 50 people have noticed her. This is the idea that, a young girl in the company of two men is wrong. That she needs to be escorted by an older woman or some other individual. You cannot be out in public with a man, is the view that is expressed by young women. And Winterbourne's comment is very hypocritical. It says he raises his eyebrow and makes a comment, I think it's a pity to make too much fuss about it. Well, what has he been doing earlier? Making a fuss about it. You're not going to go talk to that gentleman, are you? And Dave says, of course she is. I'm going to go talk to him. Why shouldn't I go talk to him? And of course, Winterbourne makes this comment about the right person, listening to people, doing the right thing. Mrs. Walker now shows up. They've just been at her house, being the right actions by Daisy, that she can't be doing that. 50 people have noticed her. Well, did Mrs. Walker count the number of people, or she, One, she's in Rome, Daisy is. Very few people probably know her. So what does it matter if people are noticing her? But it's the idea of the entrenched attitude, following the conservative, very, what we would call, now what was called the Victorian attitude, of young women always being very circumspect, being very, polite, but very distant in company, not being alone with any individual. And what we have here is this conflict. Mrs. Walker, again, sort of expressing the same idea of Mrs. Costello. And so what you wind up having is that Mrs. Walker talks to Winterbourne, and Winterbourne tries to, although he just has been criticizing Daisy earlier, he now defends her, saying she's very innocent. And Mrs. Walker's comment is she's crazy. And then makes a comment about Mrs. Miller. And so it says, I ordered the carriage, put on my bike, came here as quickly as possible. That Mrs. Walker is actually in her carriage for the very reason of trying to find Daisy and bring her back out of making what she deems is a mistake. Because Daisy's not doing what Mrs. Walker believes should be happening. So they talk, and of course she tells Daisy, you need to get in the carriage with me. Do get in, drive with me. But it's just enchanting, it's just as I am, that she's having a good time. And this is what Mrs. Walker says. It may be enchanting, dear child, but it's not the custom here. And that's the part. It's not the custom here. And Daisy refuses to follow what was customary for this particular place. This is not what she is looking at. That she is looking at acting as she did back home. As I mentioned, she was, she'd already told Winterbourne she had a number of gentlemen friends back home. The gentlemen were always coming to see her. She was always in the company of gentlemen. Well, she's in the company of gentlemen here as well. She's not allowing anybody, as she says, to dictate to her. What was customary, what is custom in one place is not going to be a custom for her. She's going to do what she wants. That independent of mind and action is marking Daisy. As she says here, I am more than 5 years old, and Mrs. Walker's comment is, you're old enough to be more reasonable. You are old enough to be talked about. And Daisy looks at her and says, talked about, what do you mean? And this is what I don't think I want to know what you mean. I don't think I should like it. And again, that about being reckless. And this is what she looks at. She looks at Winterbourne. Says, does Mr. Winterbourne think that to save my reputation, I ought to get into the carriage? And it's that view about her reputation. Again, this is what Winterbourne looks at. Says here, speak of her reputation. The gallantry he thought was to tell her the truth. The truth, as a few indications, was that Daisy Miller should take Mrs. Walker's advice. And that's why he tells her, I think you should get into the carriage. You know, this idea that Winterbourne is going to allow the custom, the mores of society, to dictate how he's going to act and how he believes Daisy should act. What Daisy looks at Winterbourne is expecting that he should instead say, no, I'll go with you. We'll continue our walk. That was more important to him compared to anything else is Daisy. That he's not going to allow someone else to tell him how he should regard her. How Daisy, what kind of person Daisy is. He should know that for himself. Remember, she has told him. When he says he's going to come to Rome, he will come to Rome and look her up. That his aunt's going to be there, and she's asked him to come. And Daisy tells him, I want you to come to Rome for me. And this is another one of those moments that we see where Winterbourne can't bring himself to act. He is Winterbourne. He is trapped, frozen in place. And as such, he allows what society wants to impede what he should want. And when he says that, this is what Daisy, it's a violent laugh, so you can tell that she's upset with him at that time. Use the word violent. I've never heard anything so stiff. If this is improper, Mrs. Walker, then I am all improper, and you must give me up. I hope you have a lovely ride. And there she goes. And so Winterbourne, Mrs. Walker brought to tears by this, because of course she's just been, trying what she thinks is doing best for Daisy, and it's not appreciated, so she gets upset by it. She tells Winterbourne to get in the carriage with her, and this is his reaction. He answers that he felt bound to accompany Miss Miller. Miss Walker then says if he refused her this favor, she would never speak to him again. So Winterbourne catches up with Daisy, and Mr. Giovanelli says that Mrs. Walker had a claim for her, and he's going to have to get back. So he goes back and gets into the carriage with Mrs. Walker. Instead of standing up for Daisy, as Daisy wants him to, he backs down. He retreats into the carriage. He retreats into the mores, the moral standards of the old world, and refuses what could be the future. Daisy, her attitude, her actions. And the result is that we see a very distinct aspect. Contrast there. And so this is, where they have a discussion. This is what Mrs. Walker, I'm told that at their hotel everyone is talking about her, and that smile goes around among the servants when a gentleman comes and asks for Miss Miller. Servants be hanged. The poor girl's only fault is that she's very uncultivated. This idea, uncultivated, that she needs to be properly tended, as if she's, a flower in a garden. Daisy, the reference to the name, remember, a flower in a garden needs to be cultivated, brought up into the proper format. That's not how daisies grow. And that becomes an important aspect. That's not how great daisies grow. And this need to cultivate Daisy, as Winterbourne uses that comment, is part of it. So the result is that you have, in the last part of it, that conflict. Again, the next day, where you have the details, he goes to, Mrs. Walker having the party, Daisy not there, Mrs. Miller is, and they talk. Says that Daisy was all dressed, but she's got a friend there, Mr. Giovanelli. They got going at the piano that Mr. Giovanelli sings, and so they were working on a song, and they're left there together. Again, conflicting with what he would expect. That Mr. Giovanelli had to practice, and he's brought, and he's going to sing. And remember, Mrs. Walker was saying she never wanted to see her again or anything. Here she comes to the party. And so you have Winterbourne showing up. And of course, this idea that she makes, excuse me for that. Excuse me, things are popping up. Says that it's P, the room's so small we can't dance, she says. And Winterbourne, of course, answers, I don't dance. And of course, this is a telling remark. Daisy understands Winterbourne very well. Of course you don't dance, you're too stiff. Remember, that's what his answer earlier is what she says about being stiff, about refusing to be malleable or accessible or flexible to accept. Did you ever hear anything so cool as Mrs. Walker wanted me to get into her carriage and drop poor Mr. Giovanelli, and under the pretext that it was proper? People have different ideas. And Winterbourne says he should never propose to a young woman of this country to walk about the streets with him. And that's what he says. He never would have looked at an Italian young woman to walk with him. And it says, where then would he have proposed her to walk? It says, this is not, and she says, I'm not a young woman of this country. She insists. And that's that standard, that breach that we see, that as you're looking at the details here, you see that what's occurring is there's a difference. And she goes, I don't see why I should change my habits for them. And there's that distinction. Now, as you go through the rest of the novel, this novella, Daisy, of course, has this distinction and action. Winterbourne gets upset about her relationship with Giovanelli. And again, I want you to note that Giovanelli is almost always described as Daisy is seen by Winterbourne. He's very handsome. He's very handsome. He's the most elegant man in the world. He's always described by the physical aspects, not by anything else. And we don't know much else about Giovanelli. Winterbourne makes, when he sees this relationship, he gets upset about it, but he doesn't take any steps about it. He doesn't try to go to Daisy and say, listen, this is what I need. This is what I want. I keep telling Daisy she's engaged, Miss Miller. She says she isn't engaged. And so Winterbourne thinks that she has acted this way, that she has allowed herself to be engaged, and this is what he tells himself. She's too light and childish, too uncultivated, unreasoning, too provincial. That this innocence, that this attitude of being uncultivated, this is part of what he keeps telling himself about Daisy. She's provincial. She's country. She is not sophisticated, and as such, is she really one to be accepted? And when you have the conversations between the two, and you still have some, it comes out in that way. And she tells to, he's told that they're going to, people will not address her, that they'll cut her in society, give her the cold shoulder. And Daisy tells Winterbourne, I shouldn't think you would let people be so unkind. I think you should say something. And his comment, well, I do say something. I say that your mother believes you're engaged, which, of course, being engaged would make it a little more proper for her to be with Giovanelli, that they would, sort of be meeting some standards. It's a way of explaining or rationalizing. Well, she doesn't say she is. Says, I am engaged. Since you don't believe it. Yes, I believe it. Oh, no, you don't. well, then I am not. And that's what she tells him. She's not. But it's only the way he can accept it. And as you go through the end of the novel, again, she's looking at everything, and she's talking about how lovely it is. I never saw anything so pretty. I'm afraid that you will not think Roman fever very pretty. This is the way people catch it. And the idea about being out in the evening, out at the Colosseum, and the idea about the likelihood of catching it. He says, I told Signorina, that would be Daisy, it was a grave indiscretion. But when was the Signorina ever prudent? And that whole idea that she's not going to follow what everybody else has seen. I have seen the Colosseum by moonlight. But Winterbourne doesn't say anything. Did you believe I was engaged? It doesn't matter what I believed. Well, what do you believe now? And this is what he says, in sort of that telling remark. I believe that it makes very little difference whether you are engaged or not. And this is, sort of a telling moment in the relationship, that Winterbourne has made up his mind about Daisy. That she is uncultivated, provincial, not up to standards. And there's supposed to be the pills they could take, and, about taking the pills, I don't care whether I have Roman fever or not. And this is telling it, said Daisy in a little strange tone. And that becomes really the key aspect. She wanted Winterbourne at this time to have stood up for her, to have told her, no, he didn't believe she was engaged, that he knows something else, that he feels something else. And it doesn't happen. Instead, Daisy becomes sick. And there's a message that Mrs. Miller gives. Mind you tell Mr. Winterbourne that she's not engaged. And this is an aspect that we see. He went to ask for news of her and saw Mrs. Miller. Daisy spoke of you the other day. Half the time she doesn't know what she's saying, but that time I think she did. She told me to tell you that she never was engaged to that handsome Italian. Mr. Giovanelli hasn't been near her since she was taken ill. I thought he was so much of a gentleman, but I don't call that very polite. A lady told me that he was afraid I was angry with him taking Daisy round at night. And so, a week after this, the poor girl died, and Daisy does. Grave in the little Protestant cemetery there in Rome. Winterbourne goes to it with a number of other mourners, a number larger than the scandal would have led you to expect. Giovanelli was there, and this is Giovanelli's comment. She was the most beautiful young woman I ever saw, and the most amiable, and she was the most innocent. And Winterbourne says, why the devil did you take her to that fatal place? She wanted to go. Says she would never have married me, I'm sure. And so this idea about Winterbourne seeing this, and this is what is really telling. He had the chance to have stood up, spoken to Daisy, and done something. And he doesn't act. He doesn't, and this is that key theme that James explores in the novel. This idea of holding on to the past, holding on to the values that have been, or embracing the new. At no time can Winterbourne bring himself to embrace the new. He always has to fall back into the old. And so this is where, the idea about leaving the next summer, he meets up with Miss Costello again. And this is a comment that is made. He spoke of her to his aunt. That he had done her injustice, and Mrs. Costello said, well, how did your injustice affect her? She sent me a message before death, which I didn't understand at the time, but I have understood it since. She would have appreciated one's esteem. Is that a modest way of saying that she would have reciprocated one's affection? And his comment is, you were right, to his aunt. I was bound to make a mistake. And this is his comment. I have lived too long in foreign parts. And you would think that this time then he would have moved on, that he would go back. If this seems to be a sign that he's going to go back to America, this is a chance for him to change, now grow and develop, no longer be caught in the winter, but move on. But James shows that's not so easy. And look at the very end of the novel, it says he went back to live at Geneva. He is studying hard, that he's interested in a very clever foreign language. A lady, excuse me. But there he is. He falls back into the old habits. That the experience with Daisy hasn't brought about change, although he recognizes the need for it, but he doesn't. James explores quite a bit within this novel. It's really a telling remark as he looks at the old and the new, the changing attitude, and that the old will not accept what is changing. That the confrontation to the old is going to hold on and will overwhelm the new if it's not opened. And as such, we see Daisy dying on foreign soil, buried on foreign soil, but representing something different. The wave that is going to be happening and going to take place. And James looks at that idea. And it says here, he sees the raw protuberance among the April daisies. And that he sees the daisies, they are not cultivated daisies. This is not a cultivated garden. It's a raw exuberance, a growth of it. Remember, he wants daisies to be cultivated. We don't do that. This is not how it is. And he failed to appreciate it. And James is saying it's that lack of appreciation and willingness to embrace the new that eventually is going to lead to a troubling aspect, a troubling future for the old. I hope that as you go through the novel, you see these details, how it's being offered and developed, and as was being presented.